The leaf blowers thing is pretty cool. I think we don't do those anymore.
The Lord be with you. Maybe one more time. The Lord be with you. Gracious God, we thank you so much for that message from Susie today about the joy of Easter and your creation. We ask that you bless us as we have this forum from the Creation Care Committee. We ask that you bless our efforts as we treasure your creation. In your holy name we pray. Amen. And now, as you get your items, if you would come and sit down at the table, I'm going to pass the mic over to Karen, and Karen will go forward.
Good morning. Thank you for coming downstairs today. Climate change is the defining challenge of our time. For us, for our children, nieces, nephews, and their children. Today we will hear about what is happening to address this challenge in the business world, beyond our homes, our church, and our town. It will be an interesting and exciting discussion. I'm Karen Royce, on behalf of the Creation Care Committee, which actually the Creation Care Task Force, we're not a committee yet. Stuart Lindsay, my co-chair, and I are putting on this forum. Thank you very much to our guests for giving us their time and sharing their expertise with us. Scott Kalb, who's on my left, is a Park Avenue neighbor and has had an esteemed career in the financial world. He served as the Chief Investment Officer and Deputy CEO of Korea's 200 billion sovereign wealth fund, as a Managing Director at Citigroup and at other positions in the financial industry. He's now a consultant to the World Bank on growing capital markets in developing countries. 5 years ago, Scott embarked on a new career of sorts. He has served 2 terms on the RTM, I think from District 7, including as Secretary and Legislative and Rules of the Legislative and Rules Committee, and most relevant for us today, he served as a member and Secretary of the First Selectmen's Waste Management Committee, which convened in September of 2020 to improve the practices and economics of managing our solid waste and recycling. This past November, Scott was elected to the BET, Board of Estimate and Taxation, the key board in our town because it approves the annual budget and the CIP budget, capital improvement projects. Out of his local and state work on waste management, Scott recently co-founded Bright Feeds, a multi-million-dollar Connecticut-based waste reduction company located in Berlin, Connecticut, near the state incinerator that closed a few years ago. Check out its website and learn a lot about the environmental and economic impact of food waste. Bright Feeds, BRIGHT, I learned that if food waste were a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter of CO2 in the world. On my right is Dan Abbasi, a fellow Northern Californian, where I'm from, husband of Debbie Smith and son-in-law of Mary Catan, father of 3 outstanding Christchurch choristers in their time. Currently, Dan manages a sustainable equity strategy for Douglas Winthrop Advisors in New York, which incorporates climate and other environmental risks into opportunities into fundamental investing. He also co-founded a TV production company with 2 producers from 60 Minutes, and with a big team produced 2 seasons of a major TV series on climate change. called Years of Living Dangerously. And since we're in Greenwich, he added to his bio, there are probably a fair number of Yaleys around, and he was Associate Dean at Yale's Environmental School. Our panel moderator, Stuart Lindsay, as I said, co-chair of the Creation Care Task Force, is the husband of Phoebe Lindsay, executive director of the Greenwich Botanical Center, and father of 3 children who have all served as acolytes. Actually, 2 still serve as acolytes. One of our stated goals in the Creation Care Task Force is considerations, that's not going to make sense of that sentence. That environmental stewardship is woven into the fabric of Christ Church decisions, whether it is worship, altar guild, property and campus, maintenance, finance, endowment, youth and children's programs, the nursery school, etc. We need a sustainable roadmap, sort of like a board game we played as children, except we need to establish the goal. In Candyland, we know what the goal is. We have to decide the goal here at Christ Church, and then what are the steps and moves to get there. Stuart serves as Chief Sustainable Officer at Campbell's Soup. He leads a team that partners with all aspects of Campbell's business, from procurement to marketing, operations to governance, with the goal of achieving environmental goals and developing sustainable products that connect people through food they love. Prior to Campbell, he worked at the Nature Conservancy and for many, many years at Bunge Limited, which is a global food and agribusiness company. All 3 men hold MBAs from prestigious institutions, and Dan also earned a master's and a PhD in political science. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here and delighted to moderate this esteemed panel. One of the first questions I usually get when we talk about these topics is, well, how did you get into this? Why are you working on these issues? And for me, I used to be in the issues management communications world, and so working at a big agricultural company, you quickly learn that sustainability and environmental issues are in fact the issue that you have to work on. So 20 years ago, I started delving into this, and slowly it became my job, full-time job and complete job, which was a very happy transition, because these are topics that are both, or at the same time are critical, they're cross-cutting, they're endlessly fascinating and interesting, changing all the time, subject to a number of different forces, both internal and exogenous, political, environmental, economic, physical, you name it. And so it's been a really fascinating space to work in. And I think some of those forces that I mentioned we'll talk about today, and we'll also talk a little bit more about how, as individuals, we can think about these topics, we can act on these topics, and we can take them from what we're doing at home into what we do in the business world. So we'll get right into it. And I'd like to start off just by starting with you, Dan, and say, how did you get into this space? What are you working on now, and how did you get from A to B?
Great. Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Stuart. Great to be here. So this being church, I'm going to start with a confession, and that is that I've worked in the past with the U.S. Catholic Climate Covenant after the Pope's encyclical on climate Laudato Si a number of years back, and prior to that with the Southern Baptist Convention on trying to break the kind of the political logjam on climate change. As you all know, it's unfortunately become a bit politicized, and I've never to date really thought about this church as a place to be involved on environmental issues. I've been a member since Debbie and I moved back here in 1998, and we were married here by Terry Ellsbury in 1991. So, and it's just causing me, I don't have an answer yet to this puzzle, but we do compartmentalize our lives a little bit, and it's something I'm working on. And honestly, working on climate change for the past 30 plus years, most of it, has been hard. We've made some progress. There've been some wins, certainly some setbacks. It's been pendulum swings, and it's challenging at times. And I think I'm surprised I haven't leaned more on kind of spiritual support on the church, and many of you who are friends. So that's something that I'm really grateful to Karen and Stuart for launching this effort, because it's catalyzed me to think about things a little differently. I've been in touch with the Episcopal Church Central, their deputy head of creation care, just this past week. And there's really a lot of great things going on in the church that we're going to talk about. So what I'm doing now, Karen mentioned it, I manage a sustainable equity strategy at Douglas Winthrop Advisors. It's one of two strategies. The other is a generalist value strategy. The firm's been around 25 years. We're based a block from Grand Central, and about 7 years ago we launched the sustainable equity strategy that I run. And it's fairly simple in some ways. Our view is that the world is changing rapidly on the environmental front: climate change, water stress, agricultural degradation, loss of biodiversity, and these affect companies. We think it's going to differentiate companies that succeed from those that don't, particularly over the long term, although it's happening quite quickly, and we have been outperforming markets, indexes and things. I'm obligated by my compliance officer to say past performance is no guarantee of future returns, but it is something that we think is material and something that we need to factor in. So how did I get here? So in high school, we were in the midst of kind of the Cold War. There was quite a bit of saber rattling between Reagan and Brezhnev. I really had a calling. We can call it a passion, but in some ways a calling. I would to work on arms control and nuclear issues, and I kind of knew it wasn't going to be fun, but I was drawn to a sense of purpose, and kind of felt I would have the the fortitude to sort of take this on and work on it. So I studied Russian for 5 years. I lived in Moscow in 1984. Where there was a lot of Orwellian propaganda and all the rest of it. Debbie and I, later on in that work, studying arms control and being out of Stanford, found ourselves living in the Eastern Bloc when the Soviet Union dissolved. Putin, unfortunately, didn't get the memo, but as we're now seeing. But it did change my trajectory, and we were living in the middle of the Black Triangle, which is a highly polluted area, really devastating pollution. My mother had worked in Congress doing environmental issues, climate change, so I've been hearing about it around the kitchen table, and I came back from the Eastern Bloc, and the Earth Summit was happening, and I got a job as a financial journalist covering the negotiations leading up to the Earth Summit in Rio that you all may remember. That's where the Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed in 1992. So it was just a remarkable event to see the world kind of grappling with this other issue, very different from, obviously, nuclear war, the threat of nuclear war, but in some ways, many have compared it and said just as dangerous. Different time signature, kind of more slow rolling, although accelerating lately. And I was drawn, again, by a sense of purpose and in a sense that there was something meaningful to do here. And I sometimes kind of joke and say I've tried everything since for the last 30 years, worked in academia, government, at the Environmental Protection Agency, and in media and other things. So it's a multifaceted challenge, and we're working away at it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dan. Very interesting. Scott, how about you? How did you get to this latest chapter? And while maybe you're telling us that, could you give us a little bit of a sense of what, from your vantage point, what you have seen of being some of the changes over the last several years in this topic, and how you're thinking about that, both in professionally and in general?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Karen and Stuart and everybody else, and thank you very much for coming. It's great to see so many of my neighbors and friends here. So I'm delighted to be speaking. I think my role here in a way is to try and inject a little optimism in a great challenge we're facing today, which is dealing with climate change. Let me give you, I'll just give you a very quick synopsis here. I've gotten into this space. I'm doing a lot of different things related to this area, but I want to focus my comments today specifically on Brightfeeds. Brightfeeds is a company that I co-founded a few years ago, and what we do, it's a circular economy story, which is very important today. It's something that we should all be thinking about. What we do is we convert food waste or wasted food or unused food, we convert it into animal feed. So that's what we do. And the way I got into it was actually was through public service. So 5 years ago, I became a member of the RTM with a number of people who are here, actually, from District 7. I live right down the street on Park Avenue. And I quickly became involved with the waste management issue. And so most people don't like talking about it, but I spend a lot of time talking trash. That's what I do. And so our town, actually, I was asked to join the First Selectmen's Waste Management Committee, and we worked on that for a couple of years. Our town disposes of 50,000 tons of waste a year. About 15,000 tons of that is recycling. The cost has been going up every year. It costs our town about $7 million a year now, and it's rising. And there was a problem because the incinerators in our state, most waste, the way our system works is that waste is aggregated and then it's brought to, it's aggregated at your transfer station, otherwise known as the town dump. And it's brought to an incinerator or a landfill, so it's burned or buried. That's kind of how our system, it's a very old system. That's what happens with most of our trash. And the incinerators were, the biggest incinerator in our state, called Mira, which was right in the middle of the state, near, not far from Hartford, was shutting down. Now, Mira handled 1 million tons of waste a year in this incinerator. And it was a municipal incinerator, so it acted as kind of a brake on pricing. But it was very old. There's about 80 of these giant municipal incinerators all throughout the country. And they're all shutting down gradually. They're 50, 75 years old. They need a huge amount of investment. They're very dirty. It's an economic justice issue. Most of the time they're located near very poor neighborhoods. They're polluting. So it's a big problem. So in our state, this one was shutting, and the state was sort of wondering, well, what are we going to do, right? That's our state disposes of 3 million tons of waste a year. So this was a third of the disposal capacity. So I then started to work with the state, which was the Connecticut Coalition for Sustainable Materials Management, the CCSMM, kind of rolls off the tongue. It was set up by the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and it was gathering people from all the different municipalities to say, we have to come up with some solutions. What are we going to do? And it just became apparent to me while working in our town and then with the state that we needed some kind of new solutions to deal with this problem. And so we were working, and we found that recycling, which is something that we all do, our recycling ratios are pretty good. We can talk about whether recycling really helps or it works, but for the most part, we have a recycling ratio of roughly 25% or 30%. So we do a lot of recycling, and that's good. But what I found was that on the food waste side, we're just barely scratching the surface. And food waste is 25% of the total waste stream. So that means in our state, 800,000 tons a year of waste that we're disposing of is food waste. And in fact, in our country, it's 160 million tons of wasted food a year. It's astonishing. Globally, it's 1 billion tons of wasted food a year. And it's a terrible economic problem, and it's also a terrible environmental problem, because the wasted food that right now that is going into incinerators or landfills accounts for about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And the costs are rising and rising and rising. In our town, you may not know, but your waste disposal bill is about to go up because we've had to raise the cost of tipping fees, which is the fee that you have to pay to dispose of your waste at an incinerator or landfill. So all these challenges, and as a result of that, I got together with some colleagues, and we worked with some scientists, and we said, we can come up with a solution here. So we came up with Bright Feeds, and Bright Feeds, we use AI technology. We have a couple of patents, And what we do is we're able to take food waste in, and we're able to save a lot of money for businesses and municipalities, because they can bring their food waste to us at no cost, zero. So they save a lot of money on what they would otherwise have to pay to dispose of their waste. And we also are carbon negative. So we actually are removing, for every ton of food waste we process, we remove 1 ton of carbon from the atmosphere. So that was what our mission was, and so we set out to do this. And I'll go into it more in a little bit, but the take-up has been tremendous. We opened up our plant about 15 months ago. It's right in the middle of the state in Berlin, Connecticut, call it. And we are already processing 190 tons a day of food waste and converting it to animal feed and selling it to farms and agricultural complexes around the country. So I'll just stop there.
Fascinating. So Scott, that well illuminates kind of what we'd say a global challenge, but from a local perspective, let's say there's a market gap, increasing or pending market failure here in Connecticut that Bright Feeds is addressing. Dan, you I think as an equity strategist would tend to look at things more macro, maybe from top down, if I may. So, what are you seeing as some of the critical trends and critical factors out there that are driving these issues?
Yeah. Well, first, Scott, thank you for that work. Waste management is a really big part of this equation. I sometimes say, there's many other pieces. It's an all-sector, all-geography affair. Investing in and moving toward a resource-efficient, low-carbon economy, but this is really a big and I think underestimated piece, particularly the food waste piece. On recycling, some things are recycled a lot more effectively than others. Aluminum, much more, for example, than plastics. We all have plastic cups here. We've invested in a company that is a leader in aluminum packaging, which is recycled at a much, much higher rate because of the value of it at the end. And there's been a fair amount of effort by the oil and gas industry to sort of push so-called advanced recycling. And unfortunately, the recycling process there is really energy intensive and problematic. So what we're looking for and investing in are things like substrate shifts from plastic and even glass over to aluminum, which are recycled at a much, much higher rate. So to answer Stuart's question, we look at a few different things. We actually are kind of bottom-up and top-down. We're definitely looking specifically at companies that are investing in things like regenerative agriculture, beauty companies that are sourcing their palm oil in a way that doesn't drive deforestation, healthcare companies that are helping us cope with animal and human disease that we're unfortunately seeing more of as the climate warms. COVID was a wake-up call as far as a big systemic challenge, whether that was engineered in a lab or was spillover from animals to humans, unclear, but that is something that unfortunately we're seeing more of as tropical diseases migrate north, and there are companies that are really doing great work on the diagnostics, the therapeutics, and so forth to cope with those. We've all heard about egg prices, right, being up. We've experienced it. Avian flu is a big driver of that. It was partly the Ukraine war and the grain feed, the spiking in prices, but a big driver was actually avian flu and the culling of poultry flocks. And unfortunately, that disease transmission cycle is something that's accelerating, and the virus lives longer outside, due to a warming climate. So there are these interconnections that people aren't always aware of that are really important. But we look at things like physical risks on the macro side to answer the question. Physical risks, regulatory progression or regression, right, because it can go both ways, consumer expectations and willingness to pay for sustainable products and services, again, something that varies across markets and sectors, and then technology disruption. And I think you asked, Stuart, kind of what's the single most important. I guess I would say two, partly because they're a little more insulated from political factors, and that is technology change. The rate of reduction in the cost of renewables is really impressive and inspiring. 90% reductions in the cost of wind and solar, for example. And by the way, we're going to get to God's creation a little bit in a few moments, but God has kind of shown us the way here. We've got a huge fusion reactor in the sky, which which is the sun, right? And we have heat, geothermal heat in the middle of the planet. That we're now tapping, and it's a great technology. You can do district heating off a geothermal loop, and people are amazed at how it actually improves the quality of life. You don't have to listen to the condensers on a hot day and things like that. So we're seeing more of those thermal networks. It's been in the papers recently. Lots of opportunities that can actually improve the quality of our life. If we kind of look at the principles of God's creation, now you might say, well, God also gave us fossil fuels, but we have perfect circularity on the planet. The problem with fossil fuels when we combust them is there's an externality there that we're essentially putting those emissions, those greenhouse gas emissions, 59 billion tons last year, into the atmosphere. Whereas if you use geothermal, if you use solar, meaning tapping that fusion reactor in the sky for solar power, we're in a circular economy. So technology is really, really important to this. And then I guess the other one would be the physical risks, which are implacable and really coming at us. We have a chance to sort of bend the curve, and we're late, honestly, to be very honest with people. We're having been at this 30 years. We're running a little late on this. We're at a bit of a fork in the road. The path is now shorter than it would have been had we gotten going in a more concerted way earlier. But if you just think about, I've had friends literally outrunning in a car in Northern California, a raging wildfire, going as fast as they could to get out of the way. I had a cousin whose boss died in a landslide, a mudslide in California. We've seen, the Mississippi River running low. Panama Canal is running low right now due to low rainfall. We've got, these are real events that are coming at us, and I think are a big reason why people are waking up on this. But the final thing I would say, so I mentioned physical risks, regulatory, technology, change, and consumer expectations, but final factor, I'm tempted to call it not the X factor, but the S factor, is kind of the spiritual factor, which I think is part of what we're talking about here today. And I acknowledge that, I've compartmentalized my life a little bit. I've been driven, to work on these issues, but there's a real gray zone for leaders like Stuart at these large companies where they can operate as leaders or laggards, well within the realm of what's legal, in terms of compliance. And you can either get out ahead of it, and Stuart is doing some of that work, thankfully, at Campbell's, or you can be a laggard and kind of wait to be pulled along. And I do think a spiritual commitment to this creation is something that is meaningful and can be motivational and kind of help when you go out into the practitioner world from this sacred place, to stay motivated to really be at the right more aggressive end of that.
Thank you, Dan. We're going to close. The last question we'll tackle is really about building on Dan's last point, which is what we can do and what organizations can do collectively. But let's just stay one more minute or two on the economics of things, because I think, Dan, you mentioned externalities. Scott, you were talking about what you saw in Connecticut in terms of changing price structures. But a lot of this does come back to economic pressures, right? And we know that there are future costs that we'll all have to bear. Those aren't translated really directly into the marketplace today in a highly efficient, transparent way. But I think your examples, they're starting to be seen, and there's starting to be opportunities there. So could you elaborate a little bit more on what you saw, and also kind of what does that maybe tell you about how would you communicate to others about how that trend is going?
So thanks for that question. I think it's a very important issue. What we're seeing is that global warming is increasingly having big economic consequences. And I really appreciated Dan's comments. We all have a duty of care. I guess we'll talk about that in a bit. But we have to think about the environmental costs. We have to think about the economic costs. And there's a lot of interesting solutions being developed for a whole variety of problems, from energy, renewable energy, to solar, to clean water, to I'm working in the waste area, which is one small segment but important. But what I found that's really important is if you want to drive change, you got to make sure that your solutions are economic. Now that might sound funny, but in other words, you can go to a business, or you can go to the legislature, or you can go everywhere and say, I have this great solution, but it's going to cost you money to implement it. Now, this is going to be really good for the planet. It's a really great thing to do, but it's going to cost you money. And when you come up with a solution like that, a lot of businesses will turn around and say, well, that sounds great, but that could be really tough. It could put me at a competitive disadvantage. I could lose business. My stock price could go down. My boss could fire me. I mean, all these things. And so to the extent that you can go to a business and say, or you can go to the legislatures and say, well, here's a solution that is going to help us in this battle to protect our planet. But it's also economic. It's going to save you money. You're going to make money on this. And then all of a sudden, what I found is that people they're so happy. Businesses, legislators, they're so happy because they all want to do the right thing, but they want to de-risk it, and they also want to make sure that it's not going to cost them or be a penalty. So if you can put that together, in our case, it's very simple. For you to dispose of your waste, it costs, in Connecticut, it's $120 a ton to send it to a landfill or an incinerator. Now, if you separate out your food waste, you can bring it to me for free. In fact, sometimes I might even pay something for it. So all of a sudden, all these businesses, that's why we went, there's composting in the state, there's anaerobic digestion, and those things have been around, and they're doing maybe, I think, a total of 20,000 tons a year or 30,000 tons a year. But why did we go from 0 to 190 tons a day, which is equivalent to, we're doing now approximately 60,000 tons a year. How did that happen? It's because businesses all of a sudden are so excited because they can save money and they can also contribute to the battle against global warming. It's branding, and so that really helps to drive change. And we're now going to go to other states. There should be something like this all around. So my suggestion on the economic side is there are big economic pressures, but what we have to do is we've got to come up with solutions that bring good technology and that also are economic, and then you can really drive change. The other thing I would say is, this is just a sort of a general comment, is we need to get politics out of decision-making and business when it comes to dealing with environmental issues. This should not be political, right? I mean, we know what the effects are on our planet. We know what the effects are on our economy. We know that by 2050, if global warming, temperatures rise to a certain level, we already know kind of what the impacts will be on global GDP. We can discount it back. We know the impacts, and they're devastating. And it should not be an issue of politics where you've got vested interest groups saying, well, I want this, we should do this. There was an article in the paper today, in the New York Times, I don't know if you saw it, front page. And what it said, it was talking about how, well, under one administration we get all this, we get climate change regulation, and then under another administration it all gets rolled back. And then it gets put in place, and then it gets rolled back. I mean, this is kind of nonsensical. We should all be able to come together and agree we've got to address these problems. It's not political. It's the world we live in, and we should be able to address them in a sensible way.
So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it's interesting. I've invested in a company, I'm not going to mention the company, where the CEO has said, we'll pay more for inputs. It's a food and beverage company sourced from regenerative agriculture. We're going to pay more for it. Now, to Scott's point, and I appreciate the point, the economics are a huge driver here. But when a CEO says that, what are they saying? Well, it's partly a matter of short-termism versus long-termism, and kind of saying, look, I am going to have to also communicate to my customers, why am I doing this? Customers have the power of choice. There's a lot of cases where they are willing to pay a few pennies more or even a little more than that, 10 to 15, 20%. There's studies of this, willingness to pay studies, that show people will pay more, in certain cases for, the product that is more sustainable. So that CEO is saying, I'm going to have to both, I'm choosing, again in that gray zone, choosing to be a leader here to buy regenerative inputs right, to drive, so we don't have the soil depletion and the agricultural degradation. It's a big enough company that they're saying this is a systemic risk. You can't do business on a ruined planet. I'm a big part of the equation here across the globe. I need to preserve the planet. So that we can keep thriving. A lot of the value in a company, the so-called terminal value, is way out in the future. That's how we do it in equity analysts. And you need to be operating not just in the next few years, but 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. And then the second thing I would say is business is incomplete. I can tell you, having been a regulator at the Environmental Protection Agency and worked many years, more years now in business, is that business will never go fast enough on its own. You can have visionary leadership. Precisely because of things like externalities that Scott and I agree on, you need to regulate it. The only way you price an externality, meaning the emissions, the carbon emissions, is if the government comes in and does that. Now, Europe has done it. They've got European trading system. It's essentially a cap and trade system that puts a price on carbon emissions, and lo and behold, once you price it, people, again, going back to the economics, people emit less. We've had those battles in this country. I testified multiple times to Congress in 2009, the last time we got reasonably close on a cap and trade. You need 60 votes in the Senate. Couldn't quite get there, so we don't have one. So we had the Inflation Reduction Act, which is definitely something to celebrate, which is more an incentive-based system, not a pricing system. Set of incentives that are, very, talk about vested interests, negotiated through, domestic content requirements. So where they sometimes say, look, climate change shouldn't have to be a jobs program, right? When Nixon launched the war on cancer, he was not touting the job creation benefits. We all saw clearly enough that it was worth fighting cancer in its own right, and climate change should be in that same category. Now, it shouldn't be political, Scott, but the reality is it is. We do need good government leaders. We do need good government policy. The parties have gone back and forth on this. Both parties have been good on environment at various stages. They've been bipartisan at times. Lately, unfortunately, we're not, and I do think it's something that we should incorporate into our voting choices, really be aware of where people are, because this is a classic collective action problem. Uncoordinated action by all of us will not get there. And, look, we absolutely should compost our food, we should drive an EV, we should put solar on the roof, and so forth. But we also need to work together, and I think that's going to be our last question, so I'll hold it. But in terms of what we can do together here in the Episcopal Church, which has been quite actually active on this. But let me pause and go back to you, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you. That's good comments. I think that is where we wanted to end up, was really looking at this from two levels. One is what we can do as individuals, and what we can do as faith-based communities or as organizations in general. When I speak to students and others and they want to get into this space, I often say, well, you can take a couple of paths, practically speaking. You can go into business or the marketplace, let's say, and you have to recognize then that you are working on maybe a different time scale, and Dan alluded to this, or you're looking for opportunities. They may be big or small. You can go into the science and, let's say, the regulatory side of it, or you can become an advocate. And each of those have pros and cons, for sure. They're fulfilling in different ways. They're frustrating in different ways. What advice can we share today, you think, about what folks can do as individuals and what folks can do as organizations? Scott, you want to start off?
Sure. I think we have to be good stewards of our planet, of our environment. We have to be responsible. I think you need to think about, we need, I think, as a country and as individuals, we need to be more cognizant of circular economy. It means we have too much single-use products that we do. We buy stuff, we use it, we throw it away. And I see that in the trash stream where we're working. It's not necessary. There's so many things that we should be recycling and reusing. And one of them, an obvious one, is food. It's a nutrient, it's a resource. I can feed animals, I can feed people, there's all sorts of things we can do. But we should be much more careful about single-use plastics. I always carry actually says Mira, which was the old incinerator. I always carry my own water bottle. I don't use plastics. If you're going to use plastics, I think it's better to use paper. But what should we do? We should think more individually, cut down on fast fashion, recycle your food. Try not to use as much single-use plastics. Go get refillable bottles and do stuff like that. These are small things, but if we all did them collectively, they'd be meaningful. I mean, as an organization, I work with large institutions on helping them to deploy their capital responsibly and sustainably. And there's an interfaith organization which works with church endowments around the country. And they work collectively to do good advocacy on climate and sustainability. And they also work together to make sure that when they deploy their capital, there's two things. When you deploy capital, number one, do no harm, right? You don't want to invest in things that are going to pollute the environment, that are going to contribute to slave labor, that are going to contribute to corrupt business practices. You don't need to do that. You know, when investment takes place, you don't need to invest in bad guys to make the returns you need for your endowments or your savings. The second thing is, can I have good impact when I'm investing? Is it possible that I can invest my savings, our capital can be invested in such a way that we can make a return and also have a positive impact? And those are things you can think about and get involved in. And as a community, if you're not already part of the Interfaith Endowment Investment Organization, I think it's something that you should look into.
I'm going to answer the question slight roundabout way. I want to just ask a survey question. How many of you got into the path of totality for the eclipse on April 8th? Anybody? Anybody? Oh, nobody. Oh, my goodness. Okay. Huh? Okay, one. Okay. So it was an overpowering experience. I'm curious what your experience was, and I'd like to talk to you. But it was an incredible, overpowering experience to see this, this kind of black marble surrounded by the ethereal coronosphere and the sun. And I was thinking on my 9-hour drive back from Burlington, Vermont, whether I'd become a pagan sun worshiper or like Susie's daughter in the sermon this morning, a God is everywhere person. But I think it may be the Holy Spirit that I saw. I'm hoping. It was certainly a glimpse of creation. And the message that I took away, I'm going to talk to, is Terry still here? I'm going to get some counseling from Terry on sorting all that out. But the message I took away was we're not as in charge as we thought we are. This is called the age of the Anthropocene, where humanity's having an enormous impact on creation. And Bishop Curry, presiding Bishop Curry, I've been listening to him a little bit in preparing for today, and he says if you love the Creator, you must love creation, right? And I feel like this was a glimpse of creation, and that we need to learn from creation. I think one of the things we need to do is not think of ourselves, he talks about, it's not, dominion doesn't mean ownership, it doesn't really mean ruling, it kind of means caretaking, being a wise caretaker. Even that feels a little hierarchical to me. I talked earlier about technology innovation being a key driver, and we've all heard a lot about artificial intelligence, right? Well, what is artificial intelligence based on? It's based on the brain, the neural processing of the brain. God showed us how a really powerful computer could work. It's in our brain. That's part of the creation. We are part of the creation, right? And now we're using AI, which is really derivative of what I call NI, natural intelligence, or creation intelligence, to decipher God's creation. So Airbus trained an algorithm on the growth patterns of single-celled slime molds and mammalian bone structures, and once they had trained it, they used that to create a lightweight airframe for the aircraft that they built, right? To print that out using the patterns that God had showed us in the creation that the AI picked up. So AI feels like this, feat of human ingenuity, and in many ways it's derivative of the creation. So one thing, and it's a very maybe broad answer, initial cut at Stuart's question, but I think we can all be humble and learn, spend more time in nature. We were cast out of the Garden of Eden, and there's a duality out there. We need to get back into nature and absorb the intelligence, get into the path of totality, get into the path of nature and absorb it. In terms of specific things, my real encouragement to everybody, it's very normal to think of issues like this as things where we have to operate within our personal zone of control, to recycle and to drive an EV, as I mentioned earlier. But and it's a bit of an unnatural act to advocate. Most of us don't really like to. We don't like to have to persuade other people. It feels uncomfortable. But we're at a stage on this issue, on climate change and the environment, where we really do need to get out and talk to people about it. And despite the politicization, you have to kind of walk through that and talk about how important this is. And the Episcopal Church does have a public policy network. They trained people for advocacy on the Inflation Reduction Act and climate change. They have an open call out right now for people who want to be UN observers at the next Conference of the Parties, which is going to be in Azerbaijan in November, Conference of the Parties for Climate Change, which is once a year. The world gets together and tries to negotiate and ratchet up our push. The Episcopal Church, at 2009 at its convention, established something called the Genesis Covenant, which was supposed to, which the pledge was we would reduce our emissions operationally within churches like this building by 50% within the next 10 years, and we missed it. I called Phoebe Chatfield, as I mentioned earlier, to see what happened with that, and we missed it. The budgets weren't there. We missed it. It did catalyze some good things and some work on environmental racism and other things that the church is doing. But so we need to reinvigorate this. We need to reinvigorate it and reinvigorate the opportunity to advocate federally, to go down to these advocacy opportunities in DC. I would like to go down with a group of people here, if you all are interested, to do that. And again, this is not at the exclusion of doing things in your personal lives and patronizing companies like Stewart's that are moving ahead on incorporating climate risks and opportunity into their operations and doing renewable generation and the rest. But it is about kind of an unnatural act for many of us, which is really going out and communicating on this to our elected leaders and urging that we have stronger policy. And there's some really good direction there. Just this week, the Biden administration put out some coal rules that are going to basically say, look, you need to capture your emissions, or you can't keep operating. And it's a real aggressive rule to sort of tap down on coal plant coal plant carbon emissions. So, thank you.
Thank you both. Excellent comment.
Thank you. Can I just make
Of course.
one quick thing? I just want to let people know, by the way, if you're interested in Bright Feeds or learning more about sort of the waste and the issues regarding carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, you can go to our website, brightfeeds.com. We got some nifty little videos. I narrate one of them. But also, from time to time, I organize trips to visit our plant, which is about an hour away in the middle of the state. So if you have any interest in actually going up and see what it looks like to do one of these things kind of plant, let me know, and we can let you know when our next plant tours will take place.
Thank you both. I think, Karen, go ahead.
Thanks. Since we're at the call to action moment, I'd like to say that we have started food waste recycling during the forum, and that green barrel right over there. Please put your food waste there, and then your garbage in the open-topped barrel. I think advocacy is very, very important. Thank you. I want to thank the worship people for using Eucharistic Prayer C this morning. If you heard, that was very much a prayer about our environment, our world, and our responsibilities. Call to action, think about what it's made of when you're buying a box of fruit that's made of plastic. What is going to happen to that when you're finished? I think pre-cycling is actually more important than recycling, because you think about what you're buying before you buy it. Next Saturday morning, we're having a cleanup day, a campus cleanup day, which Creation Care does twice a year. Everyone's invited, families are invited. We'll find something for all ages to do. The organization that does voluntary food waste recycling in town, Waste Free Greenwich, is a very important key organization here. And we can all either drop our food waste off, solid food waste off, on Wednesdays at their locations or at what I still call the dump. I've amazed personally, since I started doing this, my trash bag weighs almost nothing because the majority of what was in there is solid waste. I neglected to say that I was mentioning everybody else's partner. Scott's partner is Peggy Edersheim Kalb, who is the outgoing chair of the Greenwich Library Board. And one last thing is on the subject of whether it's a political issue or not. I'd hoped to I invited Bob Ingalls here, but he couldn't come because he doesn't work on Sundays, but he is from South Carolina, was in the House of Representatives for many, many years, and when he was primaried out in 2010, he turned his efforts to energy and enterprise. And another website to look at is republicen.org.
Can I just
He's a
say,
Republican who's doing a lot.
Bob is a close friend of mine, and we absolutely should try to get him up here. I will lean on him to see if he can work on a future Sunday.
He'll come not on a Sunday.
It is a trip from South Carolina, but
He'll come on not on a Sunday.
But
I've talked to his people.
Yeah,
I heard
yeah.
him speak at a League of Women Voters,
Yeah.
tackling climate change,
Yeah.
Virtual talk.
But Bob is a quintessential example of how this can be and should once again be a bipartisan issue, and he's been a real courageous leader, and would encourage you to get to know Bob. So we'll see if we can make something like that happen.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen. And we'll have time for just a couple of questions. It's high noon now, so we'll pass the mics out to the audience.
Wow, okay, so thank you. That's a lot to unpack there. As far as I know, that Stamford has, because I've been in touch with their transfer station, and the manager of that transfer station, his name is Dan Coelho, and they have a pretty robust program there. They got grant money to do food waste, they're doing food scrapping and other things, and they also, as far as I know, they're doing recycling. This thing about trucks, you know, one of the things is, do you have a municipal waste service, so municipal pickup? If you have a municipal pickup, you can direct how the trash gets picked up. If you have private service, it's a little harder to control what the private guys are doing in terms of mixing their waste. Many of the guys nowadays, I'm giving you just a bunch of different comments here, because I don't know the specifics here, but many of the guys have these two-level trucks, waste trucks now. So you can use the same truck, and in one, you have one area where you flip a switch. So it looks like you're putting your recycling or your waste, general municipal solid waste, in the same area. But when you flip the switch, it takes it and compacts it and then pushes it into a different area of the truck. So I know this because I see a lot of people who go out and say, oh, they're complaining, saying, these guys they're mixing all the trash, and actually, in many cases, it's not mixing. It's a dual-purpose truck. All right, let me just finish one point here. In terms of recycling, it is true that we used to be able to sell our recycling. So we actually would make money on everybody would make money on recycling. We can't sell our recycling anymore. Nobody's buying it, the used plastic. And so the costs for recycling are going up. We used to get money on it. This is as a town, but it's everywhere. And then it went to zero, it was flat. And then now we actually pay. We pay about $75 a ton to dispose of our recycling. And remember, it's $120 a ton to just dispose of your waste. And the costs of recycling are going up. And why? It's because a lot of the material in recycling actually can't be recycled. So we send our stuff to a recycling facility, they pick through it, they sort it, and what can be reused, they take out, they sell that. And the rest of it goes to a landfill. So, okay, sorry, I'll stop right there.
Two questions. One, is there a consensus that incineration is better than just dumping the garbage in a dump? And the second question is, are there things you have to do to the food waste, antibiotics, treatment, whatever, and certifications you have to get to certify it as permissible use for animal feed?
I'm sorry, the second, I got the second part of your question. But
Incineration versus burying the...
I mean, this is like the choice of two evils, right? I mean, burning stuff goes into the, it's terribly polluting, it's dirty, it's awful. But burying stuff is terrible because it emits methane, and that's about, in terms of greenhouse gases, it's about 20 times as toxic as just straight carbon emissions. So it's a real problem. I'll let Dan jump.
Well, I was just going to say, landfills now, there's a landfill gas capture. So they're capturing the methane and typically either making it into electricity or cleaning it up for making it into pipeline quality natural gas. So there is some, ability to sort of manage it as opposed to just freely emit it, and probably better than incineration. But really, neither, as Scott said, is operating on circular principles. And if we design in, as Karen has said, also, design in up front, circular principles, really emulating, again, creation, right? Creation is perfectly circular. It's a closed system, right? Every waste is an input into another process. And so God has kind of shown us the way, and we're taking a while to get to it with these processes that, essentially generate lots of waste.
Right. So the other thing about a lot of those processes is they're not carbon neutral. So in other words, when we take methane and we process it, we have to use a lot of energy to make energy, so it doesn't really help us on the carbon emission side. On the food waste side, yeah, we're regulated by the FDA, so the food comes in. It's actually a pretty neat technology. And again, if you're interested, come see it. But we use a lot of AI. The food comes in, it gets sorted using sensors based on the nutrient content. We know everything that comes in. If it's high in protein, goes to one place. High in oils and fats goes in another. High in carbohydrates or sugars, another. And then we can mix it. And then when it gets processed, it has to be very finely managed. It goes through a dryer at 600 degrees for about 15 seconds. And depending on the moisture count, if it's higher moisture, it's a lower temperature, goes in longer. If it's lower in moisture, it's a higher temperature, goes in quicker. You have to manage all these things because either, you don't want to burn the food, that's no good, it turns into ash. And at the same time, you have to handle it correctly to kill all the pathogens. So it's a complex process. It is regulated, and
Thank you.
It works.
I have a question for people who are still here. Who would like to go on a tour to Berlin? Okay, we'll organize one.
Okay.
And when I was in Tanzania, there were people who made biogas out of their at least animal waste. Is that at all an economically viable strategy?
Yes. I mean, so that's a very important part because now you're talking about animal waste or sewage. You can convert that. The way that you make biogas is you take waste and you stick it in a tank and then you liquefy it. If it's already liquid, that's better, but you have to liquefy it, and then you heat it, and you turn it into a gas, and that gas is used to power turbines, and those turbines are then used to either make electricity or to turn into a biogas. And then you have to clean the gas and release it, so it's a very complex process. That's not at all what we do, but that can be very effective. It's still so far, it's not quite economic. They still need a subsidy, but it's far less than the cost of what you pay to just burn it or bury it.
One more, Monica?
Thank you for being here, Karen and Scott. Thank you. I just wanted to say that I am very hopeful listening to you because most of the time it's very upsetting hearing about things, but having you gentlemen, Karen, Stuart, doing this is amazing. So thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll end on that.